call the May 1st, 2018 Union County Planning Board to order. First thing on the docket, I'd like to congratulate Charlie moving up to a voting member, and Patrick being re-elected, and then next month we'll probably have some alternates possibly. Correct, Brian?
I hope so.
That's what we're gonna have this month.
I hope so.
No, we want to guarantee it. No, I'm just kidding, just kidding. Okay, but appreciate you guys, what all of you do that are here tonight. I believe we've got enough to establish the voting members and quorum, and ask that you take a look at the agenda for additions or deletions to the agenda. Do we have any recommendations or comments on that? If not, I would ask for a motion to approve the agenda as presented.
So moved or second.
Patrick, second. I got everything. Thanks, guys. Appreciate that. Good deal. In your package, you have the minutes of the April 3rd, 2018 meeting. Was there any additions or deletions that need to be made to those minutes at this time? If not, we would ask for a motion to approve the minutes from April 3rd, 2018.
So moved.
Thank you, Russell. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Charles. Appreciate it. Okay.
Wouldn't mind a vote.
Oh,
Yeah, that way we,
all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay. All right. Excuse me.
I figured as much, but
Yep.
that way we
Yep.
got it correct.
Okay. First item tonight is RZ 2018-001, 104 Sandy Ridge Road.
They brought me out of the bullpen tonight. We thought I'd give Lee a night off, so bear with me. This is rezoning 2018-001. Name is rezoning. The property is located at the corner of West Sandy Ridge Road and Wolf Pond. It's about a little less than an acre, 0.927 acres, and the property is vacant. Looking at the upper left-hand corner, this is looking from the church there on at the corner of West Sandy Ridge and Wolf Pond. Looking from the church over at the property, you see it's vacant. The middle one on the top is looking from the property back towards the church. The upper right-hand corner is at the corner of the property looking down Wolf Pond Road. The bottom is looking from the property over again towards the church. Same thing again from the middle one, and the furthest one on the right-hand corner is from the property looking across at an old convenience store there at the corner of Wolf Pond and East Sandy Ridge Road. As you can see, the property is like halfway between 601 South and 200 South, so there's no municipalities anywhere nearby. Here's a little development status. Again, you can see the property. If Wolf Pond runs north and south, which it kind of does, and Sandy Ridge runs west to east, you can see the property is in the northwest corner there. The property behind it is all residential. All that gray with little dots is the subdivision. So you can see that upper northwest corner is basically residential. Across to the other side and looking at the northeast corner, like I showed you on that picture, the piece of property right in front of him is zoned commercial, and it's an old service station and a little storefront. If you come across East Sandy Ridge to the southeast corner, you have again, a little commercial there at the corner and a little commercial down Sandy Ridge. The property down Sandy Ridge, I think, is some type of light industrial. If you come across to the southwest corner, right at the corner there is Alton Presbyterian Church. And directly behind Alton Presbyterian Church is another light manufacturing. So you can see that the area is a mixture of residential, some commercial, some institutional with the church, and some light industrial. Here's an aerial shot of it that shows the environmental features, and you can see from there, since the intersection of Sandy Ridge and Wolf Pond is at the top of the hill, so there's not really further upper corner there. You can see some water features, but basically no significant environmental features associated with the property. Transportation, you can see there's some on Wolf Pond on 200, there's like 2,000 average daily. This was back in 2016, and on West Sandy Ridge, 1,300 amount of traffic there. I think you have it wasn't in Lee's slideshow, but in the handouts, I think you had a handout that was like this. Was that in the handout? Yeah, in there you can see the light industrial. It says on the red pieces that it was B4. It's actually B2. I wanted to point out that all the red property, including the property being requested rezoning, is B2, and you can see it's completely surrounded by RA40. As far as utilities in the area, most everything is on, some kind of septic system. There is some wells and some county water there. The rezoning history, this is kind of interesting. I want to point this out. The property was originally zoned RA40. Back in June of 1990, it was rezoned to B2. Somewhere along the line, the church acquired this property, Alton Presbyterian, and then here recently, they sold the property thinking the property was residential. The person that purchased it also thought it was residential and did not become aware that it was not residential until they came to the county to get a building permit to build a residential structure. At that time, he was told that when he went to get his zoning permit that the property was on B2 and therefore would not allow a single-family residential structure. At that time, based on the circumstances, the planning staff thought that that's something that we should sponsor, that it was a honest mistake on everybody's part, and that the only right thing to do was for the county, the staff to support, to sponsor this rezoning. And so this is a staff-sponsored rezoning. Let me give you a little bit on the history, on the comp plan. The property lies near a rural center. These areas are conducive to small-scale residential and some civic uses to serve the surrounding rural community. The property lies at a convergence of single-family and agricultural. These areas are mainly conducive to low to very low-density residential and farming operations. Staff's comments are that the rezoning appears to be a reasonable one. The comprehensive plan designates this area as single-family and agricultural area near a rural center. The majority of land uses are a mix of residential, commercial, and institutional. The property is contiguous to a large area already zoned RA40, and the zoning designation is not out of character for the area. Is there any questions at this time?
Any questions from the board? Okay. Thank you, Dick. Appreciate this. What's the request of this board on this particular zoning issue?
One question, is the owners, are they agreeable with this?
Yes, they came in and filled out an application, but like I said, based on the circumstances, we felt like that we should sponsor it. But yeah, they
Okay.
did fill out an application requesting this rezoning.
Okay. That's all one, that they were in agreement.
Any other questions? Anybody wanna make a motion?
I'll make a motion, we approve Chad Everett McManus's application to rezone the property from, D2 to RA40.
Second.
Okay, thank you, Charles. Thank you, Russell. Motion's been made to approve. All those in favor, raise your right hand. Okay. Unanimous, there's 5-0 to approve. Okay, the next item on the agenda, number 7, is the UDO tax amendment, section 30.080A and 30.080B of Union County Development Ordinance.
Well, that first item went so well, that boasted my confidence, I'm gonna try a text amendment now. I feel good, got that rezoning by real quickly, so. Let me give you a little background on this. This, like the chairman said, this is a text amendment associated, with the intent to offer an alternative to the strict buffer requirements in 30.080A and B. Now, 30.080A is minor outdoor entertainment and spectator sports. B is major outdoor entertainment and spectator sports. And you might be wondering, well, what in the world is that? Well, in general, entertainment and spectator sports is the provision of cultural, entertainment, athletic, and other events to spectators, such as typically occurs in theaters, amphitheaters, cinemas, auditoriums, fairgrounds, stadiums, arenas, and racetracks. Now, minor, what's the distinction between a minor and a major outdoor? A minor outdoor is those entertainment and spectator sports that primarily occur outside of a fully enclosed building and meets the following criteria. This is to be minor. You can have no more than 50 off-street parking spaces, do not have outdoor lighting mounted more than 200 feet above grade, and do not have any speakers for amplified sounds. So those are the three things that distinguish a minor. A major is almost just the opposite. It's still, entertainment and spectator sports in a building not fully enclosed, but it has more than 50 off-street parking spaces. And it can have lighting mounted just higher than 20 feet above grade, and it may have speakers. So if it doesn't meet all these minor, it's a major. So that's the distinction. What we're requiring, the minor, it requires a 200-foot separation from any residentially zoned property. So that's the way the ordinance is today. I think Lee put here's the thing. So in the minor, you have to be 200-foot separation from any residentially zoned property. What this amendment does is it says that you can get a permit either by adhering to the 200, but you can do a study or some type of determination such that the amplified audio levels will be maintained below 65 dBs, and 65 is about basic human conversation level. So if you can do a study that determines that the below 65 dBs is less than 200 feet, from the closest R-zone property. In addition, you have to also determine that the lighting requirements, that at the nearest residentially zoned property, that it's below 0.5 foot candles. So for instance, normally it would be 200 feet from the property line, but you can do a study and it says that, well, the lighting, the 0.5 candles is only 100 feet, you know, from the property line, and the audio is only 50 feet. But you have to take the larger. So in that case, with the proper documentation, they could have an alternative method to determine that there only has to be 100-foot separation based upon the fact that the lighting was the highest. The same thing as we move to the minor. Now the minor normally requires a 500-foot separation. Major, excuse me, the major requires a 500. And remember that in the major, you can have lighting taller than 20 feet above grade, and you can also have audio. So they require a larger buffer. But if you can, through studies and determination, determine that the 65 dBs, let's say in this case that it's 200 feet, or say 100 foot from the closest property line, and the light levels is you know, less than that, say 50 feet. Well, again, the 200 foot was the largest, so instead of being 500 foot off, if you can, through these studies and determination, determine that the largest between the audio and the lighting is 200, then the separation between your uses and that closest RD or residential zone property is only 200 feet. Now, there's a precedent for this. We have in the ordinance now that section 55.120 is landscaping and screening. There's a method in there where alternative compliance method, if you can show the intent to be met in a different way, then you can have a different type of screening and buffer and landscaping there. There's also one in 45.050 parking ratios. If you can show, I think here not long ago we had a daycare center, and the parking requirements, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was rather high. The applicant was able to show, picking out different daycares throughout this area, showed that the maximum amount of parking needed was a lot less than that through these demonstrated studies. So he was able to demonstrate that the parking ratio was too high for this particular region, and so he got a lower parking ratio. So this type of alternative compliance method is not something unusual to the ordinance. So I just want you to know that, you know, there's been a precedent set for this type of approach. In this case, it's concerning buffering. And I think that's about it. So I'm available for questions.
Anybody have any questions for Dick?
Obviously, there's been some issues with this.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Obviously, there has been some issues with this ordinance.
I
'Cause
think, and Brian chirp in, because Brian's probably better at this than I am, that, you know, sometimes you have unusual lots, and especially in the cases of minors, where that 200 foot almost eliminates that uses. And so we thought, since we had alternative compliances for landscaping and screening, for parking, that the buffering, that someone could demonstrate that the lighting and the sound was within reason, that they could do a smaller buffering.
Yeah, so we've had some interest from some folks to do some types of an event, but the properties, when you start putting 200 foot all the way around it, because most of our property in the county is zoned residential. When you start putting a 200 foot buffer all around that entire property, it really shrinks the area that they could possibly have their event location. And the argument was posed, which, you know, was valid, is that, well, that was really intended on reducing the impact to adjacent property owners. Not a lot of noise and not a lot of light. Well, if we, the applicant, can show that the noise is going to be at a lower level and that the light is going to be at a lower level, but we can expand our buildable area, why can't we do that? And it made sense, because we have other alternatives where someone can show, listen, our impact is not what you think it's going to be. If they can provide that documentation, then we said, we agree with you, we think that makes sense, which is why we sponsored this text change, because we felt that it made sense. Someone is providing us with documentation that their impact is much less than what we would have thought it would be. So that's where this came from.
providing you documentation, but what's to keep something in actuality from happening differently?
So, that's a good question. So, essentially, you know, those require permits. So it's not a by right use. You gotta understand, when someone's coming in to do that, there's a process they have to go through in order to allow that use to be approved.
Will that be a special use permit?
It can be a special use permit, or it may be just a zoning approval. It depends on the use. So it depends on the use. Some are special use permits, some are a zoning approval permit process. Through that, we establish, okay, you've shown this study. We then have within the ordinance a mechanism to cite them for violating their permit. So, now granted, that's not the best of all worlds, but if their light is actually exceeding a half-foot candle from the property line, and we have the ability to determine that, we've got the thing, we can go out there and test it. If their decibel levels are exceeding the 65 decibel levels, we can determine that. Then we can cite them for violation and go through the process of either A, correcting it, or B, shutting the use down. So, not the perfect world, but we do have the ability to regulate it if they don't meet those standards.
I would point out, probably should have during the presentation, that outdoor major is a special use in all districts in which it's allowed. It's a special use in RA 200, RA 40, B4, highway commercial, and both light and heavy industrial. So in all cases, and then the minor outdoor is special use in the 2 residentials. It's a special use in B2. It is by right in B4 and highway commercial. It is by right in those. So that would be the only cases. It would be in a commercial district where it wouldn't require a special use permit. So as Brian was pointing out, you've got that extra review there of a special use permit process.
And I'm assuming at this point in time that as long as you meet the setbacks, that you're not subject to the decibel or candle power.
That is correct. Yes, sir.
Okay.
So right now, if you meet the setback requirements, there is no standard for what that audible level is.
Okay.
And there is no real standard for the foot candles at that point in time, because you've met the separation requirements for it.
So there could be abuses through that.
It certainly could be.
Right.
It was anticipated that those buffer levels were enough to prevent those sound levels from exceeding what would be a reasonable sound level. It was anticipated, but not regulated.
Any other questions? Comments?
Still seems to me that if you have some musical group or something like that, they're bringing their own sound system a lot of times, and it might exceed the decibel levels at that particular point, but then they wouldn't be there when you were going back to try and measure it, if you had some complaints.
It certainly could be,
I-
absolutely.
That one looks like you could get around that about 5 different ways.
And you hit the nail on the head, Charles. We deal with that quite regularly, where folks, you know, take the ordinance and they understand how to manipulate it. And that is a fact. We deal with that on a regular basis.
Brian, Dick, this past weekend, we had the Queen's Cup at Mineral Springs. They had a big band out there. So how would that relate to this right here?
Well, Queen's Cup is actually Mineral Springs, so it's not regulated by us. We don't actually have zoning over that, but let's just say.
I thought that was outside the city limits.
Yeah,
I'm
let's just
sorry.
say there was a piece of property that was unincorporated, and the Queen's Cup wanted to locate on that. Well, for us, that's a major, that would have to have a special use permit. In the special use permit, we would identify all of the standards that they have to meet. Now, here's the kicker with that one. If they fail to meet them 1 year, then we could revoke their special use permit. They wouldn't be able to hold it after that. Now, could they hold it in any way? Certainly. We'd have to go to court, and we'd have to fight that battle in court, but yes. Now, to Charles's point, if it's a use by right, there's not a special use permit, but there's still a permit that's issued, and that permit has standards that they
Any other comments or questions?
You said when you revoke it, it's revoked for, just on that site.
That's correct.
They can move to another site and,
The special use permit is specific to that piece of property and runs with that property permanently unless it is revoked. Dick, I'm sorry, I'm answering all the questions.
No, no, no.
You wanna answer, you go right ahead.
No,
I jumped in there, I apologize.
Any other comments or questions? If not, do we have a motion to approve or disapprove UDO text amendment, section 30.080A and 30.080B of the Union County Development Ordinance? What's the wishes of the board?
I move we leave it alone.
We have a motion?
That's my motion.
Okay. We have a second on that? No second. Do we have any other motion?
I make a motion, we approve it as presented.
Russell's made the motion to approve it as presented. Do we have, any other comments before we vote on that?
Oh, you need a second. I didn't hear a second.
We gotta have a second. You're right. Do we have a second?
so,
Thank you, Patrick. Okay, motion's been made, been second, so all those in favor of the revision to the ordinances as presented by Dick, raise your right hand, please.
Three, okay. And I assume.
I'm gonna vote against.
I'm voting against.
Okay, so 3-2.
Yes, I'll have to do
Okay, the next item, number 8, is the UDO text amendments, sections 25, 35, 45, 55, and 105 of the Union County Development Ordinance.
1 second, I'm making this
Oh,
note, I
excuse me.
apologize, I'm up on deck on this one.
Dick, let me say thank you for presenting that. We'll let Lee know that you did an outstanding job in record time.
I think I'll just take it easy because I was looking at it.
Okay, so, alright, so most of these, the section 25, 35, 45, 55, 105, and 80 all have to do with a zoning permit. And I'll go through them individually. The one that's section 35.040 and 030, those have to do specifically with accessory uses, and I'll talk about those later. So, some time ago, we came to the board and we recognized that we have sort of a hole within the ordinance that doesn't really stipulate that a zoning permit is required. It is inferred, but it's not really clear. And our attorneys have made that, clear to us that the ordinance really doesn't specify. There's some language that infers it, but it doesn't specify it. So we've been trying to come up with a reasonable language about having a definitive zoning permit requirement within there. And what we work with on our legal folks is really to establish that, number one, all of the principal uses that are identified in our table of uses. So if you look at the table of uses in your zoning ordinance, those are all considered principal uses. And essentially what we've done here is for section 25.04010B, we've added a section which just says any such use, and that's permitted uses within the table of uses, must have a zoning permit to establish, change, or modify that use. So essentially, all it's saying is, if I'm in B2 and I want to run a gas station in B2, to have a gas station, I have to have a zoning permit. And all that is doing is saying, I'm going to get a zoning permit. It doesn't stop you from getting it, it just means it's a mechanism for us to make sure that you are doing what you're supposed to be doing. You're meeting the requirements for it. If you want to change that, again, we're having a permit because you're changing the use. That's what section 25.010B does. And anytime you have questions while I'm going through these, please stop me, because they're all related, but I wanted to go through them, at one time so you could see how it works together. Yes, sir.
How tight is that then? If a guy wants to run a gas station as an example, and then if a guy wants to run a gas station as an example,
Right.
then he comes back and says, well, I wanna add a car wash to that. Does that have to come back before you again?
As long as the car wash is ancillary to it and is not principal, then no, it does not necessarily have to have a zoning permit. So keep in mind, is it ancillary or is it a principal use? Now, there are sections which talk about ancillary, and I'll get to those in just a minute. But for that particular scenario, that's ancillary. That doesn't require that. Now, let's say that he had a gas station, but he also wanted to sell cars. Those are two principal uses. They're not ancillary. He'd have to have a separate zoning permit for that. It could be done, but he'd have to have a zoning permit for the selling of automobiles, like a dealership, and he'd have to have a zoning permit for the garage portion of it, because they're not really considered, they're two principal uses. All right, so the next one is the.
Brian,
Yes, sir.
you, in the beginning, you said it was a gas station, and what if it's a garage, it's where he fixes
Well,
things?
and I'm sorry, I used the term, so either way, if he was selling gas, but then he wanted to actually run a garage,
Run
those are
fixed
two
cars.
principal uses as well.
Okay.
Those are two principal uses. Yes,
Okay.
good point. I said gas station, then I said garage, so. All right, so section 35 really deals with the accessory uses. And again, we wanted to make it clear that there are certain types of accessory uses that do obviously need a zoning permit. And again, what we've added here is a section to the ordinance which makes it clear that if you have a principal use and you are going to do some accessory use, depending on what that is, then you have to have a zoning permit for that. So, if you're doing an accessory dwelling unit, you have to have a zoning permit for that. That's for us to make sure that you're meeting the requirements of the ordinance, because there are some standards within the ordinance. If you have a house and you want to build an accessory building, we need a zoning permit, because we want to make sure that you're not exceeding the square foot requirements, because we do have limitations on square foot requirements. If you've got a small piece of property, you can't have a huge accessory building. It can only be a certain size, so we have limitations for that. So that is one of the reasons why that's called out specifically under the accessory requirements. And then we also stipulated that for a home occupation, you have to have a zoning permit for it. So if you want to establish a home occupation, we have rules for it. You have to get a zoning permit so that we can make sure you understand what those rules are, and that you're abiding by those rules for the zoning permit. Now, once you understand, the zoning permit is $40. That's what it costs. It's not excessive. It's really just a way for us to track that you're meeting the standards of the ordinance. That's all that is. It's not like you're paying hundreds of dollars to get a permit from us. Any questions about that particular section?
It says it also includes athletic facilities.
Yes,
So
sir.
if you have a baseball field and the kids are just standing behind a fence, and they wanna build an actual dugout, do they need to get a permit?
So here's the thing. No, the dugout wouldn't necessarily require that. It could require a building permit, because it depends on the size of the dugout. It could require a building permit. But if you already have the baseball field, the dugout itself does not require a zoning permit. So, now, the baseball field, yes, would require one. We have a situation right now where we have that scenario. We have a residential piece of property, has a house on it, it's got a baseball field in the back of it, a real baseball field. They can have it. It's an accessory. So That's just for us to be able to make sure that we can monitor that they have proper permits for that. Any more questions about this particular section? Okay, I'm gonna go on to the next one, which is 45. 45 is parking. And for this particular item here, what we wanted to clarify is that in the event that someone is having to add parking for their use, if they're having to modify it in some way, then they would have to have a permit. Because most of the time what we think about is a permit is for structure, but sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes what we have is someone has an existing structure and it used to be used for something else. Maybe it was a convenience store. Years ago, that's what it was. And it had a certain amount of parking spaces that it was required to have for a convenience store, and it met those requirements. But then someone comes in later on and buys it and says, you know what, I want to run a restaurant there. Well, restaurants have a much more greater parking standard based on the number of seats that you have, and the more you have, the more parking spaces you have to have. And so we have to have a mechanism to make sure that those individuals are applying the amount of parking spaces that they are supposed to have for the use that they're changing to. Doesn't stop them from changing the use, but we have to be able to make sure that they're meeting those requirements. That's a good example for what we're dealing with on that one. That's this basically talking about how we monitor parking for uses that are being established or changed or modified in some way. Any questions about that section? Okay. Yes, sir. Okay, so section 55, very similar, which talks about outdoor lighting. In a similar situation, it is not uncommon for us to have a use that is built that they don't put any lighting up. They're not required to have lighting on their site. And there are lots of situations where a business or a development has no lighting whatsoever. And then they decide later on, listen, I got a parking area, my customers are complaining about it being unsafe, I want to put some lighting in there. Well, again, we want to make sure that they're meeting the standards of our lighting ordinance, because we do have standards that they have to meet when they're establishing that. So this would be a mechanism for us to make sure you are actually complying with those requirements. Any questions about that section? All right.
Does this
Yes, sir.
include farms?
So that farms are not regulated under the zoning ordinance. So there's no zoning permit, there are no zoning standards for farms. They're completely exempt from that, as long as you meet the farm exemption requirements, and those are fairly simple to meet. All right. Section 105, this is the last one that relates to the zoning permit, and that specifically talks about, and you'd ask that question about outdoor facility. Well, we had to provide a definition of what is an outdoor athletic facility, and that's what this is. We're establishing that, it is, baseball, softball fields, basketball courts, tennis courts, football fields, soccer fields. It does not apply to somebody putting a basketball goal in their driveway. That's not what this is intended to do. But if you put a basketball court, then yes, that's different. That's a little larger, a little bit much more of an impact. We at least want to require that you get a zoning permit for it. I mean, you can't do it. It just means we want to have a zoning permit so that we understand what you're doing and you understand what you're doing. So we've tried to identify specifically what we call an outdoor athletic facility. Any questions about that?
So if somebody's gonna build a full court basketball on their
They need a
property,
zoning permit.
and they have to come through us and through the
They
commission?
come through staff for that.
Yeah.
It doesn't come to the planning board,
Okay.
because again, it's allowed. It's just you have to have a zoning permit, because again, there may be some setback requirements they need to meet. Are they gonna put lights up? We're gonna put lights up around the, okay, we need to be able to tell that person, here are the standards you have to meet. And that's what the zoning permit's for. Now, these are all related to a zoning permit. I'll get to the other ones after this, but I wanna talk about, you have questions specifically about why we're asking for this, and if you have any concerns about it.
This is any property that you own.
This is any property
You
in
have-
unincorporated Union County.
If you have a house, you build a house on a property and you bought a property next door that's just all wooded and you clear it to make a soccer field, you need a permit.
Yes, now understand a soccer field on a vacant piece of property may be considered a principal use, and it may have some different standards as opposed to, I got a house and I'm gonna put a field behind my house. So it all depends on, is it principal or is it accessory? If it's by itself and it's on a piece of property by itself, it's principal. There's some different standards for a principal use. If it's with a residential piece of property, it's accessory. There are different standards for accessory. So it really depends on the use and the intensity of it. But yes, it would have to have a zoning permit.
Yep.
Good questions. You guys always make me work for it.
Any other questions? Okay.
Go back to one second, you were saying, if, like for lighting, they'd have to have a permit for that? If
So
they,
you-
if they were to put on the soccer field, say, for nighttime or whatever, what about like netting? If they put netting all around the whole thing so the ball doesn't go out into the woods
No,
or
sir,
whatever?
that doesn't require.
Okay.
Only lighting, parking, and the use itself. So netting, no, that would not require a permit for that.
Do we have a motion on, item number 8, the UDO text amendments, sections 25, 35, 45, and 55,
And 105.
and 105? Have a motion to,
I'd like to make a motion, that we do certify that we do approve these text changes. Particularly one in there where I think there's some delineation about how much you can do or what you can build relating to your work and all on a lot. So I think that would be good. I like the lighting and noise thing. Go ahead. I'm making a motion.
thanks, Everett. The motion's been made. Do we have a second? Thank you, Patrick. Call for a vote. All those in favor, raise your right hand. 5-0. Okay.
Now, section 80 also has to do with the zoning permit, but I want to talk about it just separately, mainly because all I wanted to do here is establish the actual process for obtaining a zoning permit. And that's what this is. This goes in our process section, which is what section 80 does. There are, for principal uses, there are certain greater standards you have to meet for principal uses. So the zoning permit requirements are a little bit more detailed. For just coming in and doing a home occupation, it's just an application, you fill it out, and that's all it is. Same thing for accessory use, it's application, you fill it out, and that's all it is. You don't necessarily have to have all of those items, but we have to at least establish what a process is, and that's what the text change for section 80 is, establishing what the process is as far as zoning permit. Looks like it's very onerous, but it is not. Yes, sir?
I think you got out of order a little bit, but that's,
I'm sorry, that still has to do with the zoning permit process, and that's why I wanted to go back to number 80, to make sure that you did realize that that had to do with zoning permits.
So we're dealing with item number 10 now.
Yeah, I'm sorry, because it's 80.140, and because it dealt specifically with zoning permits, I did want to talk about that one, so I apologize, I jumped ahead on that.
We're slow.
No, that's my mistake. I should have made those concurrent, but I didn't put those in the right order.
Could we have Dick back up here?
I've lost
Motion's
the
been made
board.
to have Dick come.
I've lost the
Oh, yeah.
board, oh my gosh, okay.
Are you okay, Dick?
Trying to get
I'm all
out of
choked
it.
up.
Trying to get out of it.
But this is a fairly logical progression, is it not? This
It
is
is.
just a formality.
It is a formality, and again, if you look through our ordinance, we have processes for how we handle rezoning, for how we handle a special use permit. Those are all within the ordinance. It was recommended that we establish what the process is for zoning permit.
A formality,
Yes, sir.
a protocol.
Unfortunately, yes, sir.
Any comments or questions for Brian? On section 80.140? Okay. Do we have a motion to approve or disapprove section 80.140?
I move we approve it as submitted.
Thank you, Charles. A motion's been made. Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
Russell, thank you for the second. All those in favor, raise your right hand. 5-0 again. Thank you. Thanks, Brian.
You're welcome. All right, so the last one, which is number 9, I'm sorry, I skipped it like Everett said. So number 9 has to do with changing sections 35.030 and 35.040. 35.030 has to do with accessory dwelling units. And what we realized, it was not intentional, I think we missed it, but in the current regulations, you can have an accessory dwelling unit only on a residentially zoned property that allows for a 2-dwelling unit use, so a duplex. So any one of the zoning districts that allows for a duplex can also have an accessory dwelling unit. Well, the problem is that there are a number of our residential zoning districts that don't allow for a duplex. But we're basically telling them they cannot have an accessory dwelling unit. And that's what, it wasn't intended to do that, to do it that way. It was intended that all residential districts could have an accessory dwelling unit, mother-in-law suite, or an apartment over in a garage if they wanted to have one. Those are things we're intended to be able to have, but essentially the ordinance does not allow that right now for every residential zoning district. So what we want to do is correct that and say that any residential zoning district, R or RA, is allowed to have an accessory dwelling unit as long as it meets the standards for accessory dwelling units.
And this accessory dwelling unit, is it constructed and attached to the primary, or?
It does not have to be attached, but it does have to be constructed with the same materials. So if you had it has to be, it has to be site-built. So it cannot be a manufactured home. It cannot be a mobile home that you bring in and you call that an accessory dwelling unit. It has to be site-built. If your house is brick, it doesn't have to be brick, but it has to be site-built. It cannot be you bring a mobile home in. There are limitations on size. So if you've got a 2,000 square foot house, you can only have 50% of the size of your house. You can only have 1,000 square feet of accessory dwelling unit. Now, that can be in the form of a building that's all by itself. It can be attached like a garage. It can be any way you want it to be, but it can't exceed that square footage requirement on there. So there are some limitations. We already have a provision in the ordinance which allows for temporary dwelling units. Temporary and accessory are two different things. Accessory is permanent. It's there forever. Temporary is, I have a family member that has health issues. I want to allow that member to stay on my property. That allows for a manufactured home to be done that way. You can bring it in. It's temporary in nature. You have to renew that request every so often to make sure that that family member still meets those requirements. Once they don't anymore, then the unit has to be removed. Temporary could be years, but it's intended to serve the purpose for that individual that you're caring for.
Is that, used to be that was a special use permit?
It is still a
Went through-
special use
It
permit.
is still through the special use permit
That
board?
is correct, yes, sir.
Okay.
And again, that's a way for us to regulate it. Number one, we track it, we make them give us an application yearly so that we can see you've met the standards for this individual to be living there on the property.
And we've actually had to deny, those before, whenever the, unhealthy person or the mother-in-law or mother or father moved out and they decided they would rent it or something, thinking it was permanent,
Absolutely.
and it is not.
That is very true. We, in fact, are dealing with a situation right now where we have a violation where it's not being used for its intended purpose, and we're having to go through that. But it was made clear when they got it, this is temporary, this is not permanent. But unfortunately, some people tend to think, well, it's permanent. Under the accessory dwelling unit, they can have a permanent structure. It just can't be a permanent manufactured home. Now, there's a difference between a modular home and a manufactured home. A modular home is built to North Carolina Building Code, so that qualifies. But a single wide does not qualify. That is not built to North Carolina Building Code. Any questions? Yes, sir.
We're running into this all the time. People are going out here and taking a garage, putting an apartment over it. Now, by law, we have to call the county and find out about septic.
Yes, sir.
We sold something recently that was way out of violation. I mean, it was big time in violation. And, everybody was happy, they closed, but, you know, I'm worried about down the road, somebody else goes to buy it, there's issues. And, we run into this constantly. Somebody wants to, they got a 3-bedroom septic tank, they wanna add a mother-in-law's quarters, and the kids are still home, and all this stuff's going on. Well, you've got enough people in the house for an 8-bedroom septic tank, and it really causes problems, and you know, it's really putting the realtors in a bad light. I mean, I hope it's something we can shore this stuff up, because it really does puts the client in a bad light, but puts the realtors in a big bad light.
Well-
Because we get hired to sell a property, and we're supposed to be working for the client, which we are.
Right.
But the problem with it is that the thing's it's in violation. You know, we know it's in violation, and some realtors don't know.
Sure.
But it's awful hard for me to sit and say, I don't get it when I sit on this board, and, you know, so I think we need to be cautious when we start issuing permits to make sure that if you're putting it in and you got a 3-bedroom or a 2-bedroom septic, Kathy had a house, then we just had to get the listing up. It was a 4-bedroom house out at Marshville, and it had a 2-bedroom septic system. And we just said, we can't sell this house.
Exactly.
And because they couldn't perk it anymore.
Yep.
And we said, you know,
That's a very good point.
rip the closets out and we can sell it, you know, so.
But number one, by having the standard in here, again, this requires a permit. An accessory dwelling unit requires a permit. That is a mechanism for us to then say, have you gotten your approvals from environmental health to show that your septic system meets those requirements? Now, the other challenge, which there is no fix for it at this point in time, is that environmental health is really required to approve a permit request, even if they know that the applicant is misleading them. It is not uncommon for someone to come in and say, I'm gonna build a 2-bedroom home, but they show on their plans that there's an office and there is a game room. If that plan calls it an office and that plan calls it a game room, it doesn't matter if they've got other family members living in there later on. They have to permit that as a 2-bedroom house because it's labeled on the plans as a office and as a game room. And there's nothing they can do about that. And that is pretty common for folks to go, well, I want a 4-bedroom house, but my septic system's only approved for 2. I'm still gonna build a 4-bedroom house. I'm just not calling it 4 bedrooms. There's really nothing we can do to stop that short of if the septic system starts failing then of course, then we get involved with that. That's a long, drawn-out process, but it happens. And you, the realtors, are really involved in that because that situation you described is probably what happened. They probably described it as something else on their plans when they submitted it, but it was always intended on being bedroom.
Well, the other thing, we find lots of people don't pull permits. They
Yeah.
just, they do it and then they wanna ask for forgiveness down the
We
bottom.
see that quite regularly as well.
Unpermitted work is being done. Home inspectors come in and say, we wanna see the permit. Permit's not there and we got a problem.
Yep.
So, and that happens 2 or 3 times a month, really, so.
I feel your pain, I do.
I bet you do.
So any questions about that particular item there, 030, and why we're asking for that change?
Any other questions for Brian?
If not, I'm gonna talk about 35.040. And this really has to do with actual, rural home occupations. That was where, there are 2 different types of home occupations within the county. There's a suburban home occupation, which really has to do with smaller lots and much less intense uses. And then there's the rural home occupation, which was intended to be larger lots and more intense uses, that you can have more things on there that are allowed as far as the types of uses. What we've come to realize is that the original request, or the original standard of 100,000 square feet, which is really about 2.5 acres, that's really about the size of it, is relatively small compared to the intensity of the uses that people want to use on their property. And we felt like, because there are much more intensive uses in the rural home occupation, that standard really needed to be 5 acres to provide a buffer between adjacent property owners and these folks running these operations that are considered home occupations but are more intense in nature. Because a rural home occupation is allowed to have up to 3 employees that don't live in the house. They're allowed to have storage of equipment on their property, storage of materials on their property, and those things can have a much bigger impact on adjacent property owners. So we are suggesting that we really establish a larger property threshold for rural home occupations. You can still operate a suburban home occupation, you just would have to meet those standards. And you could do it on 2.5 acres or 1 acre or anything less, but the intensity of uses is much lower. Does that make sense? Did I describe that? Okay. So that's what the request is. I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have about it.
I think we ran into this, from an issue from Waxhaw, and I think we had an apples and oranges issue there,
Yes, sir.
and,
It's out on Ski Trail. We had one with the dog kennel.
Dog
Another
kennel.
one with the contractor who's running
concrete
contract.
contract.
Fortunately, both of those were larger tracks.
Right.
But the reality here is that, you know, you still can cause a significant impact with certain types of uses.
Is that why animal boarding services is bold?
Yes. Yes, exactly. If you see what we did there, and I'm sorry I didn't get down there, is that's an excluded use because we wanted to make it very clear that an animal boarding service is not a home occupation. It doesn't mean you can't do an animal boarding service. It means you have to get a special use permit for it, because that's how we did it in the past. In the past land use ordinance, if you wanted to do a kennel or boarding facility, you went through a special use permit process, which meant your neighbors had the ability to contest what it was you were doing. In a home occupation permit, there's no ability for the neighbors to contest it, because if you meet the standards, you can do it. So we wanted to make it clear, that's not a home occupation. That's a use you need a special permit for.
And I could not agree more. I think that is a very, very reasonable thing. Because so many people went through special use permits and did it correctly.
Did it properly.
And other people just did not, then we got involved with that.
Yep.
think that's a great idea.
Any questions you have about on these two suggested text changes?
Any other comments or questions? Okay, do we have a motion to approve or disapprove, UDO text amendments sections 35.030 and 35.040 as presented? Anybody wanna make a motion?
I'll make a motion to approve.
Motion to approve by Russell, do we have a second? Thanks. Appreciate that, Patrick. All those in favor, raise your right hand. Okay, thank you. I vote.
All right, that's all we have for items, I believe.
Okay, what about, number 11, what about planning staff report?
I've got one on the, Secret Shortcut Small Area Plan. Staff and the consultants met at our second meeting with the stakeholder group to come up with some options as far as future land use plan. We came up with about 2 or 3 options for development of that area. We sent them out for comments to the stakeholders and the staff, refined it a little bit more. Now we're gonna go back to the stakeholders to refine it even more. And once stakeholders are comfortable with the suggested or proposed future land use plan for that area, then we'll go back out for a public meeting to get input from the public about the plan. So we, like I say, had 2 stakeholders meet, we'll have a 3rd meet to kind of finalize that. Once they're comfortable with it, we went out to the public to get their comments on it. And I think on the, I missed the meeting, we had the Marshall 74 open house meeting, community meeting. I wasn't able to attend.
I wasn't able to attend it either.
I was under the weather. I think we
Have as good an excuse as you do.
About 30 to 40 folks there, so a pretty good turnout.
Good. Russell, anything from, transportation?
Couple of things real quick. Had some interesting meetings of late. I did find out for sure, and I might have brought this up last time, but the money for the road has to be in and done by 2023 on Providence Road from Ray Road to Waxhaw. That has to be done by 2023.
Well, we've got survey crews out there right now.
So now, the only other thing that I thought was kind of cool was they are putting a North Carolina 200 Parkwood School Road roundabout. The available surface transportation block grant is I have to look up because they've got all these initials and stuff. But it's the next highest scoring roadway project. North Carolina 200 Parkwood School project has local matching commitments from Union County and a $1 million in highway safety funds committed from the NCDOT Division 10. The $629,000 funding would make this fully funded project. However, absent the allocation of the $629,000 in the funds, the project will lose the highway safety funds. This money was transferred over from a project, I think it's in Huntersville, that did not end up happening, and we voted to move some money for a 4 Mile Creek Greenway underpass at South Trade Street and for this project. That was $330,473 for the 4 Mile Creek project, and then this money, which I think brought it to a little over $1 million. But so that's pretty cool. They're gonna put a roundabout down there and try to slow some of that traffic down around the school.
I think that's
It'd be a lot safer for the kids and the school buses and, cause, I like when kids, all of us, when we was in high school, you play out of school and you run like the, bat out of Hades, and it's good. I think these roundabouts are really good.
tremendous.
I really do, to kinda slow a lot of this traffic down, so, and this
I've got
We
one
had a-
comment on that,
As long as
Russell.
as long as they're located in the right spot.
Yeah, we had a joint, meeting with all the other MPOs around, the Charlotte region, and that was really interesting. In fact, we met out the airport and they brought in, and the people from the airport spoke to us about all the stuff's going on at the airport. And, yeah, it's really neat, so.
Need your help on one thing, tell them to be sure that they put good, clear, viewable signs on those roundabouts.
Right.
I hate to tell you this, but I got lost on one the other night, and I wound up on James River, and Indian Trail trying to go to Waxhaw.
Wow. Well, there's six Charlotte region MPOs. I don't know if everybody knew that, but, you know, and we all met together, which I thought was very interesting. The speakers they had were great, but I didn't realize there was that many MPOs. And, these are all required by law. I mean, this is not something that's optional, it's required by federal law. And
Appreciate you working on that, Charles, you working on the bypass here, and
I believe Marshall's going to lose a couple of stoplights.
really,
Yeah. There's just not enough traffic going past it to justify all the traffic lights that they've got. And they won't get a bypass for another 10 years, but it'll happen.
Great.
They just don't want 74 to go through a place where there's a bunch of intersections anymore. They want 74 to have exits. As soon as they get the money, that's probably what's gonna happen.
Eric, any comments?
No comments.
Patrick? Any more from you two gentlemen?
it's amazing. Real
Dick,
quick,
Ryan, any more comments from over there?
Marshville has not seen any increase in, was it traffic, Kathy?
Oh, yeah, their traffic counts
In like
static.
5 years.
Yeah.
I
Right.
mean, none at all. I
Right.
mean, it's like what it was what it is 5 years ago. So, which I know the bypass is gonna make a big difference there. But, that was an amazing thing when they showed those road counts, that there was, so.
Well, thanks to Dick, looks like we're gonna get out a little early tonight, so we have a motion to adjourn.
I motion we go eat at Derby.
Okay, second Patrick, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Meeting adjourned.
All right, let me turn the recordings off. Stop that one. I ain't gonna get the one back here.
It's been very cold and very wet. Replanting already and still planting, but it's all right, that's farming.